Hi, my name is Wes Anderson. I'm Vice President of Agronomy with Croptomistic Technology, an ag tech company with roots in Canada, but I'm based in southeast Queensland in the Lockyer Valley. So I wanted to share today some examples from a farm here locally in the Lockyer Valley. Relatively small paddocks in this area typically, typically very heavy clay vertisol soil down in the valley. Some really nice soils, but there's also some challenges like everywhere else. And it's amazing with such small paddocks how much variability we can actually measure with modern day precision ag techniques and tools. So what I'll be referring largely today to is SWAT maps, or soil, water, and topography maps. So it's a proprietary ecosystem and methodology to map all the stable soil and water attributes that ultimately drive soil and crop variability. And it allows us to take proactive management on some things regardless of historical knowledge of the paddock. You know, perhaps in instances where you don't necessarily understand what past yield history was or have any of that data, or even where you can look at NDVI imagery and not really know what had happened or what was going on. The starting point is physically mapping the field. So I've got my buggy here with a SWAT box, which is our proprietary mapping device. Inside that box is an EM sensor that takes EM readings at two different depths and gives us that electrical conductivity data, or an indication of texture, salts, and moisture. And at the same time, we're collecting high quality RTK elevation data, and that elevation data is fed into a topography and water flow model. So we generate a lot of water related layers, and any of those layers can all be incorporated into that final SWAT map that best represents the variability across the paddock. So here's an example of some data from one paddock that I mapped. Relatively simple one, fairly small paddock, only 8 hectares, I believe. So we've got an electrical conductivity data layer. Again, it's just normalized, so it's from low in the red areas to high conductivity. That requires some ground truthing to fully understand. We've got elevation, pretty straightforward, just simply, in this case, feet or meters above sea level. And then we've got a topography map, which is different than elevation, you can see. And what topography really tells us is more or less depressions, mid-slopes, and hills. In other words, water collecting versus water shedding. In the case of this paddock, it was a mix of EC with a fairly heavy weighting on the EC layer because it did in fact tell me something. It was quite clear from ground truthing and taking some soil cores, and a mix of topography as well, I believe. So interesting paddock. The dead giveaway was certainly there was some difference in how easy it was to take soil cores, but the mix of species in this hayfield, which is what it was at the time of mapping, was quite evident and matched some of the EC data quite well. I noticed this difference in species change in this paddock while I was actually mapping. So here on the left, we have my screen on a tablet in my buggy, and you can see my location arrow there pointing to the west, and this is, I took a picture at the same time from the same point looking that direction as well, and you can see the change from lucerne to grass, and mostly Rhodes grass in this case, and it really matched up well with the EC map. So what that tells us right away is there's some soil properties or something related to water perhaps that's driving that change, because that paddock was all seeded to lucerne. As it turns out, there had been some floods in some of the lower elevation part of the paddock where the EC is also high, had kind of flooded and been very wet for a period of time, which maybe killed out the lucerne. The salts as well in the soil test increase as we go down into this area with the Rhodes grass, and Rhodes grass does have a higher salinity tolerance than lucerne. So the combination of those things have probably resulted in the Rhodes really taking over in certain parts of the paddock versus lucerne, and it's really as simple as that. I was like taking pictures for future reference of the soil after I test, and here's this samples from 3 of the zones that I tested in this little paddock. So you can see zone 1 here, zone 5, and zone 10. Don't look hugely different, but there is some structural difference, I would say. It was certainly harder to get the soil probe in zone 1. It was quite dry at that point in the season. We hadn't had a lot of rain, and the lucerne was a bit drought stressed actually, visually. Zone 5, it was very similar soil, but much easier to get the probe in. There was some moisture there. The crop was reflecting that as well. Zone 10, we start to see some color differences. So, and as it turns out, we get into some really heavy clay in some water collecting areas that are also a little higher in sodium and quite high in magnesium as well. So we'll look at the soil test in a moment. Here's just some additional data layers, I guess, to put some context in regards to how you might use satellite imagery to support other tools. Satellite imagery is great. We're looking at an EVI here. It's a vegetative index that's slightly different than NDVI that usually helps deal with the saturation under high vegetative growth. That being said, we're still getting a lot of saturation in this winter image here that don't depict some actual soil and topography differences that do in fact exist. But it's handy to have imagery to go back to if you know what had happened. If you understand the temporal differences, you know, was it wet? Was it dry? The problem with imagery is it's quite dynamic and temporal in nature, and you really have to understand, you know, what was going on at the time. It doesn't really tell exactly what happened or why something is the way it is. So, but nonetheless, it's a valuable supporting tool. So we've got, you know, generally in this paddock, zones 1 to 4 are really well drained. That's very common. And you get into zones 8 to 10 or poorly drained areas, again, very common theme. Now there's both landscape position and soil properties that are driving some of that too. So, and as a result, under different conditions, when it was wet back in the winter, still, you know, we see really poor growth down in these lower zones here, and that's probably both related to salts, as we'll see in the soil test, and poor drainage, possibly some denitrification as well from those wet conditions. Fast forward to the summer, when it was about when the time I mapped actually, it looks a lot different. We've got some poor vegetative growth in primarily zones 1 and 2, kind of, and that was reflective of what I saw out there too. It was, you know, clearly drought stressed at that point in time. Things were starting to wilt, that sort of thing. Mid slope, generally speaking, those areas, those mid SWAT zone areas, were still fairly strong. And again, that's a common thing where you know, under sort of average moisture conditions, those are really consistent parts of the paddock for productivity. Again, when we get down into those lower zones where there's some salt issues and sodicity and whatnot, there is, you know, there's some challenges. So even though there was actually the most amount of soil moisture in the cores in those areas, the vegetation is not reflecting that due to some soil properties. And here's the full soil test from APAL Labs. I'm not going to get into every little detail, it's too many numbers, but I highlighted a few key things, attributes that stuck out to me, I guess, as management opportunities or things to consider, at least anyway. You know, it's always interesting to see like Caldwell P is almost identical in every zone, which is actually quite remarkable. We would rarely see that. Yet there's a pretty significance in the buffering index, the PBI. So as a result of that, you might still expect some differences in phosphorus response, albeit these Caldwell P levels are so high that it's not going to be considered to be a very responsive paddock to applied P, other than maybe some starter P to overcome this really high pH. So not a lot of difference, no significant difference in organic carbon, although I could say just from sampling, you know, the carbon depth or the depth of topsoil was deeper actually in those lower zones, like 8 to 10 compared to say zone 1. Relatively low potassium in this field, so there's not a lot of variability necessarily, But having 3 samples instead of just one starts to give us a greater level of confidence that some of these things could in fact be a bit of an issue. And maybe this paddock has had a lot of hay cut over the years and not a lot of manure or something go back on it, and that's resulted in fairly low potassium levels given the soil texture, keeping in mind this is a heavy clay. I don't know, but regardless, it's there's signs pointing that potassium could be actually a limiting nutrient under some situations. Salts are a bit of an issue in zone 10, so again, this might be an explanation for why we're seeing what we are in this field and the species mix, with some slight salinity in zone 10. CEC is increasing from zone 1 to 10, kind of reflective of that texture as well. Sodium is a little elevated throughout, maybe not technically sodic per se, but it is increasing, and from that we know that the drainage and infiltration of water through the soil is generally getting worse and worse as we go from zone 1 to 10, both from landscape position and the soil chemical properties. So the reality check question I always like to ask myself is, so what? Maps are just a pretty picture until you figure out how to use them, and data are just numbers on a piece of paper until you can make sense of them. First of all, I would say nothing says everything we measure in a soil test should vary, right? We just don't know until we map and measure variability within a paddock what we're going to find. But whatever tools you use should be able to identify differences when they exist and be at a high enough resolution to be able to do that at a manageable scale though, right? So we're not talking about identifying every square meter and finding a hot spot of high phosphorus levels in a single square meter. That's not really a manageable scale. But if it's a quarter of a hectare, where we know something is different, that is usually manageable, right? So we have to consider that, and there's a bit of a trade-off there. First and foremost, usually the first thing I look at is water, and do we need to improve something with drainage? Proper drainage in a high rainfall area like this will obviously result in more consistent yields over time, regardless of rainfall year, but it also has good environmental outcomes and can really reduce greenhouse gas emissions, largely from nitrous oxide emissions when denitrification occurs. But also, if it's improving yield, it should be improving photosynthesis and carbon sequestration in those parts of the paddock. As I mentioned earlier, just having more than 3 or more soil samples in a paddock gives you a lot more confidence in the results that you're getting, whatever they are. I've seen this so often where a single composite test really raises more questions than answers, I think, and there tends to be an inherent lack of trust in those results, and having 3 or more can really improve that. In this paddock, or any for that matter, if it's going to be sown to hay, does this proactive information allow us to make some better decisions around what species we choose to begin with, and maybe even where each species is sown? Is there an opportunity to split paddocks into management zones where we actually see different forage mixes or species that are better suited to the soil? If it's too saline for lucerne or too water saturated or something, why spend a bunch of money on seed that's really not going to result in a crop? So some interesting opportunities there. Variable rate nitrogen is almost always an opportunity. That's very temporal in nature though, and very dependent on the crop and region, rainfall zone, how it's applied. But really what we're talking about here is applying for our nutrient stewardship, which is the right source, right rate, right time, and right place. There's some interesting opportunities to use different sources of nitrogen, maybe protected nitrogen sources that prevent denitrification for a certain period of time, that sort of thing. But anyway, that's a big discussion that gets pretty specific. So here's another example from another paddock on the same farm. but much different data. The EC is not as well correlated to topography like the last one. We've got some interesting things going on here with some fluvial sand deposits next to a creek from when it flooded a year ago. Again, you can see the big difference between elevation and topography. And the final SWAT map looked something like this. So again, a very strong EC influence here, just due to largely texture variation. And there was also some landforming activities that caused some funny things, like some fill areas, I think, in here. And it's creating some significant variability here. Just like the last paddock, here's the soil samples and what they look like from zone 1, zone 5, and zone 10. So you can really see the organic carbon difference here in these ones. And you know, the texture was actually substantially different. It was kind of a sandy clay. Really, it was that vertisol clay mixed in with some sand that had been deposited by water. So kind of a funny soil, but yeah, you can see some visual differences there. And here's the soil tests again. I just outlined some things in red that I thought were, you know, significant and worth mentioning. Here we can see this organic carbon, you know, almost double from zone 1 to zone 5 in this case. You know, there are some differences in pH, still quite high pH though overall, really. Again, fairly high Caldwell P, probably not really a significant difference in those, being yet the PBI, because of the soil texture and some properties, is quite different actually. Big gradient in sulfur and chloride here, which is really common when you get salt gradients within a paddock, as those nutrients are associated with salt. And they're also, of course, always dissolved in water and very mobile in water. So you tend to get this gradient going from low to high, from SWAT zone 1 to 10. That's a very, very common trend. And often in zone 10, if there's any elevated salt levels at all, these numbers really go through the roof. So if you're applying, say, a variable rate ammonium sulfate application prior to canola, for example, there's often really good opportunity to variable rate sulfur and even perhaps shut it off in parts of the paddock that are salt affected. Because of that texture difference, we see quite a range of CEC, the exchange capacity, and also the exchangeable sodium. So that's really the big factor in this paddock, I suspect, along with higher magnesium, and the combination of those two make a really tight soil in parts of the paddock in those SWAT zones, 7 to 10 mainly, I would say, and probably a pretty good case for variable rate gypsum, keeping in mind the salt issues in zone 10. All the indications here are pointing to some slight salinity in zone 10, and visual observations would confirm that. And this paddock back in the winter was also in wheat, but you know, under some wet conditions and inability to get some urea on when it probably should have went on. There's some relatively low vegetative indices in some of the lower SWAT zones where we expect that higher moisture. On the other hand, zone like 1, 2, maybe even 3, relatively strong, right? Drainage is good, again, both driven by soil texture that's better drained, no sodicity issues there either, and it's an upper landscape position that simply drains water, so all is good. We've got some, you know, those salt issues and sodicity in these zones 9 and 10 primarily, and they really stick out as being quite poor, even on a bit of a side slope, you could call it that. There's not a lot of elevation here, but on an area that should be draining due to landscape position, the crop was still relatively poor and struggling, as you can see in the image. Can also see some areas that are likely drowned out here, probably some drainage discussions or opportunities to look at as well. One of my favorite jobs is ground truthing some of this data, and these are things that we look at, or an example. And I just took a picture in two different, you know, very different zones that were very close to each other, only a few meters away really. In a zone 4, we see quite strong growth of the grass, the hay and pasture mix that had regrown here. And just a few meters away in a zone 9, I believe it was, you can see the poor soil that's just sodium and salt affected, and relatively poor growth of biomass there at the time, even though there was moisture in the soil. In fact, there were some places where there was water ponding. So anyway, it's always interesting to see how quickly things can change and how well we can actually measure that. So once again, we want to ask the question, so what? As always like to just start with drainage in a rainfall environment like this in particular. I think there's some opportunities for better surface drainage to deal with some water holding depressions that were mapped out in our data, and perhaps even subsurface tile drainage for long-term ROI. Pretty strong case with the difference in exchangeable sodium in a paddock like this for variable rate gypsum too. I did an example here with a prescription showing rates of 500 to kilos to 4,000 kilos, 4 tons per hectare. This could really vary depending on the overall long-term strategy, but just an example of how with the rate range we end up with an average of just under 2 tons a hectare. So, and that's the whole point. I mean, we're trying to apply products where they're going to have the highest likelihood of return on investment, and that's what variable rate does. You could argue we could shut it right off in zones 1 to 3 probably. That always comes down to the individual paddock and the map and the resolution of application equipment being used though. So, depending on the crop we might want to still apply a low rate just even as a sulfur source more than anything. So it gets very dependent. Kind of talked about variable rate sulfur, but again, depending on the crop, if we're spreading some sulfate of ammonia or something, pretty strong case for variable rate there too. And there's always, again, with something that's this variable and yield targets or yield expectations as variable as they probably are in one like this, there's a good strong case for variable rate nitrogen. Now, again, this can look very different depending on the crop, the region, access to different sources of nitrogen. We've done things like use technology like NTech or a nitrification inhibitor and on urea, and use those nitrogen sources in some of these lower SWAT zones 6 to 10 that are relatively wet, and we would expect the denitrification to occur in a higher rainfall environment. On the other hand, on a different paddock with very sandy soil that would be dominating in zones 1 to 4 perhaps, we might use it there for mitigating leaching loss. So it all depends on the paddock, and really with all the technology we have today combined, there's a lot of cool opportunities to use this for to minimize nitrogen losses. So hopefully that was beneficial in helping to understand SWAT maps and the SWAT ecosystem and what we can map and measure. If you're interested in learning more about SWAT maps, don't hesitate to reach out, whether you're a service provider, an independent agronomist, or a farm. I'm happy to chat, and my email is listed here. Thanks.